Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And welcome to our latest installment of A Lawyer, a Poet, and a Philosopher Stay at Home. This week, our theme is home. And we are very, very pleased to have a special guest with us, Jennifer Scurro. And I have been advertising this as a special LPP because it would be, we would have not one, but two philosophers. But I realized that I was giving Jen short shrift. Jennifer is an artist. So she can do double duty as artist and philosopher. And again, I'm very, very pleased to have her here. She's a wonderful friend. She makes me a better human being with her love, and she makes me a better philosopher by challenging me to see things in ways in which I would never do on my own or think about in great new ways. So again, welcome, Jen.
Thank you.
And I will give you all an opportunity to briefly introduce yourselves before we get into our topic. And we usually start with our lawyer first, who's outnumbered, two artists, two philosophers. So you want to take it away, Leo?
Sure. Are we first doing introductions, or I just get right into it?
Briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, no, I'm Leo Glickman. I am a civil rights and constitutional lawyer, and I guess I'm just going to keep it short because we started late and it was my fault, and I'm still trying to figure out how to do the watch party thing on Facebook. So if anyone knows, feel free to let me know.
Yeah, I need to know too. I couldn't.
Jane, go ahead.
My name is Jane LaCroix, and I am a poet. I wouldn't recommend that for anyone. You don't get to like choose to be a poet. You're assigned by the poetry gods, and you can't quit it. But you try, and you fail, and that's your job as a poet, to fail. Failing is just living, and that is how we operate in the universe. I teach poetry all over the city at different universities and elementary schools. Right now, the main place I'm teaching, that's my most favorite, is at Uptown Stories in Washington Heights, which is a not-for-profit, after-school, pleasure-based writing collective, and it's really fun. And I have two bands, Ohm Slice and the Icebergs, and 3 children, and lots of problems. And solutions.
Excellent.
So
Jen Scurro. I live in Westchester, so I'm a little outside the city. I was in the epicenter of the coronavirus, which has been a kind of new moniker I'm adding to my introductions. It doesn't give me great insight, but it definitely gives me opportunity for later when I get to talk about, credibility moving forward. So I taught philosophy for many years. Joe and I go way back from when I was before I was a grad student. So I'm a philosopher by trade and training. I'm an artist. That's more my personal part of who I am. And a mom of 2 kids, one neurotypical, one not so neurotypical. And so I've been unemployed probably for the last year. My institution closed down. So I've been out of work and I haven't been teaching. And with everything going on, it's given me kind of an empathetic feeling about what's going on in the world, only because I feel like what I've been going through for the past year, now everybody's going through. What it is to just stay home, to not do the things you used to do, and to kind of try to change the script. So, but I'm so glad to be here because this really gives me a little bit of light in the everyday humdrum that I think most of us are feeling right now.
Well, we're glad to have you. Thank you. So our topic is home. And so I'm sure there's going to be very, very different ways of thinking about this, and there's much to mine here. So Leo, you want to go at it from a legal point of view?
Sure. home is huge in the law. It's big, especially in the Anglo-American traditions of law. There's the saying, and I imparted the gender non-neutrality here, but the saying that every man's home is a castle, it goes back centuries and centuries. That's nothing new. In fact, we think it goes back to a case in England, in Great Britain, in 1603. It was called Peter Semaine versus Richard Gresham, 1603. And the quote is, it's not quite that, but it says, this was from Lord Coke. I just like saying that. The house of everyone is to him as his castle and fortress, as well for his defense against injury and violence, as for his repose. So clearly, it was already a tradition in 1603 and reported in this one particular case that home was a special place. Home was a place for safety and for peace and calm. And more than that, that the law was going to protect that. So, fast forward about 150 years to 1760, and there was another English case called Entick versus Carrington. And that case has, it's really quite a remarkably beautiful and progressive, frankly. I'm not sure like you'd hear people sort of talk like this today, but idea about home. And it was it was a case, but it was quoting actually a member of Parliament, William Pitt, who had apparently spoken before this decision in the Parliament. And it says, "The poorest man may in his cottage bid defiance to all the force of the crown. It may be frail," meaning the home. "It may be frail, its roof may shake, the wind may blow through it, the storm may enter, the rain may enter, but the King of England cannot enter. All his force dares not cross the threshold of the ruined tenement." So I think there again, you have this real forceful statement about the meaning and the importance of home. And of course, this gets picked up in our own traditions. Now, of course, we were, the colonialists were Americans, but they were brought up in these British traditions of certain liberties and freedoms. And so, really, what it was, the revolution was more about was not so much that they were objecting to the liberties and freedoms or the lack of it that was offered to British subjects, but rather that they didn't get the same liberties and freedoms living here on this side of the ocean, and that was denied them. So it was from this tradition that our Fourth Amendment of the Constitution was ultimately enacted. And the Fourth Amendment was based on, as I said, on this English tradition, on this British tradition, but it was also based on Britain's failure to observe this tradition in the colonies. So, for example, the British, the king issued something called writs of assistance, and it was essentially what it was a general warrant. And basically, the warrant was, right, we'll talk about search warrants in a minute, but this warrant would be the customs agents and police can go into everybody's homes in Boston to make sure that they're not keeping smuggled goods and they're not involved in smuggling and avoiding taxes, right? So that's up near the top at the Declaration of Independence in complaints that the colonists have. So the Fourth Amendment is based on that harsh experience and the English tradition of liberty. So the Fourth Amendment guarantees, among other things, the right of a person to be free of any sort of incursion in their home, infringement by the government, without a search warrant. And that search warrant has to be particularized, and it has to be founded on probable cause that there's crimes happening there within. And so that's our tradition, and it's our, as cynical as I am, mostly what I do is sue cops. So, you know, I get jaded about these things in the Bill of Rights. But I will tell you that the Fourth Amendment is serious business. It's really very rare. Of all the things that aren't rare that should be, one thing that's very rare is, you know, 10 cops running into a house, you know, barging the door down without a search warrant. I'm not saying it never happens, but it's rare. And that's because of this I would suggest, not just the law, but this tradition and respect that we have for home. So, you know, there's a few little exceptions to that, of course, you know, for example, that make common sense, right? So if the fire department sees someone's house on fire, they can go in the house to put out the fire, you know, things like that. And there's also a consent exception, you know, and that's what folks like me do. And what I argue about the cops about very often is, you know, the nature of consent. But that's, you know, so for example, are you really consenting to letting the police into your apartment or your home if there's like 8 of them armed to the teeth at your door? Or are you really being coerced, you know? And that's the contours and the boundaries that we talk about in courts about the Fourth Amendment. But it's unquestionable that, you know, you can't just run into somebody's house, you know, without consent and without a few of these exceptions, without a warrant. And I would suggest that that's based on our law and our conception of that liberty and our conception of privacy. So just to sort of round it up, you know, I just did a little research, a little Wikipedia research on search warrants in other countries, you know, you know, it's going to be sort of, I think, the next thing I sort of delve into because, you know, we decided to do this topic. So I didn't have time to do too much of it before today, but one thing I found pretty quickly was that, you know, for example, in Germany and in France, there's no concept of warrants. There's no concept of, in their laws, about the sort of sanctity of the home. Which isn't to say I have any idea whether or not, you know, cops are constantly running into people's homes, but this concept of a man's home is his castle, a person's home is his or her castle, is frankly unknown in those countries. And, you know, I think if any of you, and we've probably all traveled in our lives, and when you go to other kinds of countries, I mean, I remember we used to go to, when I was a kid, my mother's Puerto Rican, so we'd go to Puerto Rico a lot, and we go through these like little poor towns, and the feeling was palpable, especially we lived in the New Jersey suburbs at that time, so the feeling was palpable that the distinction between inside and outside in little poor towns in Puerto Rico was not so clear. You know, people kind of walked in and out and walked around, and the living rooms kind of extended out to the sidewalks. And so, you know, I guess I've been thinking about, and I'll end here, I've just been thinking about not only the law on this, which is kind of my job, which I do every day, but thinking about what it is about our culture and tradition that's different and that sort of generated these ideas about home. So with that, thank you, and we'll go to our person serving as our Dick Cavett, Joe Beal. And we don't hear you. You're on mute. You're on mute. Joe, you're on mute. Joe, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. I had muted myself to keep the ambient sounds of my household, you know, from interfering with your commentary there. So I don't know if I'm Dick Cavett or Joe Franklin or Merv Griffin, but thank you. I'm gonna let Jane pick up, and so I think I'm gonna let all three of you kind of go at it, and then we'll bring in the discussion. Okay.
Terrific.
So I just want to have, I'm just going to read a few poems about home. Starting with The Lake Isle of Innisfree by William Butler Yeats. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the veils of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of linnets' wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore, while I stand on the roadway, on the pavements gray. I hear it in the deep heart's core. We have home in our heart, everyone knows. And now I want to read a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks. My grandmother is waiting for me to come home. My grandmother is waiting for me to come home. We live with walnuts and apples in a one-room kitchenette above the someday liquor gardens. My grandmother sits in a red rocking chair waiting for me to open the door with my key. She is black and glossy like coal. We eat walnuts and apples, drink root beer in cups that are broken above the someday liquor gardens. I love my grandmother. She is wonderful to behold. With the glossy of her coal-colored skin, she is warm, wide, and long. She laughs and she lingers.
Nice.
Home by Glenna Luce. Dog at my pillow, dog at my feet, my own toothbrush. And this one is the last one I'll read. Written Dear by Maggie Smith. And she is responding to a line in Wisława Szymborska poem that goes, why does this written doe bound through these written woods? My handwriting is all over these woods. No, my handwriting is these woods. Each tree a half print, half cursive scrawl. Each loop a limb. My house is somewhere here, and I have scribbled myself inside it. What is home but a book we write, then read again and again, each time dog-earing different pages. In the morning I wake, in time to pencil the sun high. How fragile it is, the world. I almost wrote the word, but caught myself. Either one could be erased in these written woods. Branches smudge around me whenever I take a deep breath. Still, written fawns lie in the written sunlight that dapples their backs. What is home but a passage I'm writing and underlining every time I read it?
Those are lovely, Jane.
It's the repetition of like home repeats itself in our minds and hearts, and we're always going to it and looking for it and making it. And homes are the poems we live in.
I love that imagery. That's great. That home is a book that we write and then read again and again.
Yep, that's Maggie Smith, and I'll give you all these poems to you so people can find them and enjoy them at their leisure.
And Maggie Smith
wrote Written Dear, and that was the one that's in response to the Wisława Szymborska line, why does this written doe bound through these written woods?
I don't mean to I'll probably embarrass myself, but Maggie Smith, the actress?
No, the poet Maggie Smith. Yeah. It's one of those names. I'm sure there's like many Maggie Smiths. But
right.
she's living now. She's like a modern day poet.
Okay.
And
That's
actually,
wonderful.
yeah.
Yeah.
And all except for Yates, they're all pretty, you know, people alive now, like a little older than us.
And I appreciated your interpretation of Yeats. Your reading was moving.
Thank you.
Jen?
Well, let me, well, I could start with, I think, one of the nice things about doing this today is, as Joe knows, we published the second installment of Precarious Lives with the magazine. And I had already written a whole piece on home. And it was before pandemic broke and the city shut down in unbelievably novel ways. I was thinking through the problem of homelessness and the persistent problem that people assume is a natural fact that comes with living in an urban center, which is there'll always be homelessness. And so there's a certain amount of permissibility for homelessness to not only exist, to be tolerated, but then to be, you know, reluctantly dealt with, visible homelessness being mediated in all kinds of ways. And I worked really hard to kind of reframe the concept of home around Bell Hooks's concept of home place. I could read briefly one of the pieces that I had been thinking about for years. This is something that I keep coming back to, and she writes this in Yearning. Despite the brutal reality of racial apartheid, of domination of one's home place, was one site where one could freely confront the issue of humanization, where one could resist. It was about the construction of a safe place where Black people could affirm one another, and by doing so, heal many of the wounds inflicted by racist domination. She describes home place in this really important way of self-authoring, not as a private sphere in which one has a castle, right? That domain free from the crown, which I love that. Thank you for reminding us how much we've absorbed that as a still true fact, right? There's this kind of like fortress kind of quality to home. But when we think about the ways in which home is a space and a location more metaphorical than physical, especially as I read about home place, this kind of idea of authoring oneself, right? It's a political space. It really is. It's not a no place. It really is just a hideout from or retreat from the political. It's itself quite political. And so we published it, and I put a whole bunch of asterisks and caveats all over it that basically says, I wrote this before we were all asked to go and stay home and for long periods of time. And so as an ethicist, now I have to, and I told Joe, give me 6 months. I got it, about 6 months of true reflection and kind of curating information about what's going on now, because we discover stuff as we go. And how I would readdress some of the things that I argued. I described settler colonialism and what that means for a place like New York City. I described queer theory and what that means when it comes to the constructions of home. What happens when your birth home is a place of violence, is a place of danger, and that one can't live or stay home, and one has to go out from the home. And again, the cause of a lot of homelessness is people being displaced, not being able to stay in a home that's because it's not a safe space. I use a critical disability lens. People who are disabled, who depend on those people to care for them, in conditions of stress become abusive, can become violent. Disabled people can become disposable in our culture. Especially because that's the only place they can go is stay home. So a lot of disability advocates and scholars have really looked at what's going on now that everybody's home and saying, by the way, see what we've been up to? We've been doing a lot of this labor all along. So it's really interesting to see not only what it is to have home as a place of privilege. The two things I think a lot about when I think about home, something that was prompted in this was a place to sleep. The idea of a good night's sleep is a privilege, and that you could sleep soundly. Any of us who have slept on the subway or been out in the world and fell asleep, you know what that is, that deep vulnerability that you're out in the world and you don't know where you might end up, right? Or who might, take advantage of that. And again, reflective of my thinking about homelessness, we just had, I think there was a report of 2 homeless people who were found dead in a subway car amongst all of this. And again, that's a kind of question mark for me about that privilege of being able to know that you can close your eyes, you can remain vulnerable, and wake up and be able to use that space as a place of respite, as a place of recovery. And the other thing too is, I know this sounds really strange to bring up, but a place to toilet. I have to say, there's something really important about the privilege of having your place to go home, where you can do the things, the basic bodily functions that we all have to do, and not have to dress it up and put it on, right? So we do it with the babies, we do it with the elder care. There's all these ways in which care very much is about being able to toilet privately, toilet independently, and home does that. It gives us a place to be able to be an organic, leaky body that can do what it does, and without that kind of assumption that because I do those things, that makes me less valuable than other people, right? And you think about all the ways in which we do discriminate against people who can't do those things that you're supposed to do at home, right? And again, we've all been stuck becoming teachers to our kids, doing all these things at home that they're not supposed to be doing at home, and now we have to do it at home. So I have lots of bookmarks where we can hold questions or have discussions about kind of how the concept of home, especially if you do live in a place that is fairly urban, how home is a place of precarity. It is not a place of security. And it's become more precarious even when you do have a secure home, when you are a homeowner, or maybe your landlord says, I'll suspend the rent, which is very rare from what I hear. Again, this is not something that is evenly distributed. I got a very mild case of the virus, and I have to say, you literally can't do anything for weeks because of how bad this can hit. And we were told we couldn't go to the hospital, and we couldn't go out in the world. And so you're made to be in a space where you cannot. And again, that's where home can be a prison. And I think that's a unique experience, especially for Americans. I mean, as a general American concept. So that's part of my musings. Again, the piece that I wrote that's published, it was something I think it's a nice thing that it's out there so that we can all kind of see, oh, wasn't that nice before? So maybe I'll come back and revisit a lot of the things that I had hoped would be at the forefront of anybody's mind when they thought about home before there was a pandemic.
Thank you, Jen. And just for anyone not sure what Jen was referring to, so on the Gotham Philosophical Society website, there's the magazine Phi on New York, and Jen has 2 pieces up there in a series, as she calls, Precarious Lives. And so her piece on home is there now, as her previous one, Access, on the ability to kind of access the public transit system in New York. So anybody can go to www.philosophy.nyc, and you will find it under the magazine. You can find her article there, and I encourage you to go take a look at it. Jen, I want to kind of stay with you for a moment. There was many things that you said that are interesting and worth talking, not least of which, you talk about the ability to use, the kind of the toilet, and it makes me, on a somewhat of a more of a lighter note, I think about all the children who refuse to go to bathrooms in schools because, they just want the kind of this security of home or whatever exactly it is, whether you think you're going to get cooties or you think you could, or just, I'm just not doing that in some sort of a public space, even semi-public space. They have to wait till they get home. But Something I want to go back to something you said at the beginning, and maybe you could repeat it. You mentioned the home as political, and I guess I want to get you to elaborate a little bit more on that. I was just I've been reading Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, and she's talking about early she's talking about the Greek tradition, the ancient Greek tradition. The home space is distinct from the political. I mean, they're set up in opposition, and I suppose, and I'd like all your thoughts on this, but Leo's point, his reminding us, the rain and the storm might get in your home, but the King of England can't, seems to be in some ways an echo of that idea, or that your home is your home. It's not the social world, but so it's non-political, or presumably, but you're saying it is.
Yeah. So I have an upcoming talk with the Brooklyn Public Library. Again, this was something I was planning before and then got delayed, and I'll be doing it, I think it's May 20th, where I was going to do Arendt and Federici on the idea of the burdens of labor, and this idea that home, and not just home, but this idea of care community. I think
community?
care community.
Sorry.
And one of the things, going to the first thing you mentioned, was the idea that we are out in the world, in the public sphere, as independent agents, but when we are in the home sphere, we're dependent. We become dependent on a variety of things. And one of the things that the critical disability scholarship has helped me do is think through this idea of interdependence in the ways in which what's called home, what is in the traditional cultural sense of home, has been a site of contention, where it has been power. I mean, if we just think about the home as a castle, the levels of patriarchy that come with that, right? This idea that this labor becomes gendered, it becomes classed. Again, the economic precarities that come with being home or having a home, and then knowing that translates to a political precarity out in the public sphere, right? So some people count more than others in the way in which they manage their home, their domestic affairs. Again, you have children, you know what this is, your ability to work and have a family. A lot of people are now discovering that balance that many women have managed for many years is actually a fiction. There is no such thing. That's a magical labor act, that women have done this work of managing sets of labors, some visible, some less visible, some more politically useful, some less politically useful, less politically advantageous. And I think what that's done is it's created this appearance that home is a neutral or an apolitical. It's perpetuated that fiction. So I think, thinking of one's home as a political activity is not something Hannah Arendt had prepared to do. But the way she sets up her relationship between labor, work, and activity, I think gives us opportunity to think about those political possibilities of reframing the world in the ways in which one's home is set up. And again, care communities for me, amongst especially the disability scholarship, is futuristic. It's about what comes next, what happens now that we know how bad it is. What can we imagine, what can we hope for that will make this revolutionary, where we're not finding ourselves in the same traps and inheriting the same biases and the same ableist frameworks over and over and over again. And again, home then becomes, the construction of a home becomes a political activity of creating the world anew, which is Hannah Arendt's concept of natality, right? It's where birth happens in a really important way of you being able to act upon the world in a way that changes it. Because for her, labor is necessary labor. That's right. That's just necessary things you have to do to survive as an organic being. Work is world maintenance. This is what we all have to do just to stay within the infrastructure of a world that we've come to accept as a given, as concretized, like it's concrete. And then what happens when that concretized world becomes that apolitical, neutral fact? Well, I think that's where she wanted more for us. She wanted a love for the world. Most of us don't love the world through our work. Most of us find ourselves very much out of love with the world because of the work we do. And so I think that's where she really is useful in the way she sets up the framework. But she herself wouldn't have necessarily gone as far as I'm going. But again, I'm resourcing different scholarship that's giving some ways of saying, like, we have to revolutionize some of these concepts of which everything I am is dependent on the way in which other people perceive it. So again, I have a disabled daughter. We're looking at homeschooling her because schooling was not accommodating her in the way she needed accommodation. And it was becoming dangerous for her. And now that she's home and doing all this great work, now I'm tasked with the work of really educating her. I'm not prepared for this. And I have to tell you, that's not a private activity. This is a political act upon my family that's economically making us precarious, politically making her precarious, economically making her precarious. I think you can impoverish people if you're not careful about the way you understand how the interdependence we have in the public world is very much still operating in the private sphere and in the homes. It's not, you could pull the curtains and then whatever goes on behind closed doors is free of political interventions and political expectations. There's a lot of ways in which once you close that curtain, people's rights are never protected. And I think that's something that I would love if we did have that better conversation about one's rights. Again, even just the idea that they Zoom in their classes, and there are kids in special education that have privacy attachments to them, that they're not supposed to, nobody's supposed to know that they have special education. And so how do you maintain their privacy as young people? Because now we're all interacting this way. So I tend to troublemaker in that I want to kind of change some of the really nice, clear definitions that people have accepted and just make it so that we can ask different questions and maybe think about what could be different. Like, how can we really make it radical? And again, my house is a non-neurotypical house. The whole house is framed around sensory demands, stress. And as soon as we hear stress, we all go into action. We all start redistributing out the stress of whoever's stressing. We redistribute the labor of that stress. And again, I would argue that's political activity. That's not me privately taking care of my children. That is an act for a future I wanna have.
When you say in the danger, the risk of impoverishing people, no, I take it you're not simply, and maybe even not principally, economically. Are you talking about in terms of their kind of social, emotional resources and capital? I mean, when you use that phrase, impoverishing, how exactly did you mean it?
Well, I think if we just talk about the raising of disabled children, the amount of resources I need to get her what other kids get, that alone, the amount of time it takes, the amount of structure, the resources, like I said, everything from lawyers to advocates just to protect her rights, that puts us in a precarious state on the regular. I'm in a part of town that is not the affluent part of town. I live in a town where it's split. There are people who have a lot of disposable affluence to them and they're available. They can do all the things they possibly could imagine to help their kid in whatever way meet the demands of a society, right? I can't do those things. I find that I have to make a lot of those really hard choices about what we can and can't do. And and there's still a lot of privilege attached to me. I have a PhD and I still find myself completely without resource. I don't have a way of the tools or the means by which I can make it a fair and level playing field for her in particular. But, and then I know lots of families who, again, I'm a homeowner. I have a whole house. What happens when you are in an apartment? What happens when your apartment is, where you could be displaced fairly easily. And so that's the kind of things I hear and kind of things I know. But again, I think that makes that highly political, that this should not be the burden of some and not others. There's a lot of people who never really have to know, either in real time or even as an abstract, how very complicated it is to maintain a household when you are without work, or you don't have two parents, or you don't have multiple adults if you're a single parent, or you don't have an education. I think there's so many ways in which the more you look at the complexity of the different arrangements of care communities and care families and the way in which they care for each other, I think the complexity is, it's unfairly burdened on some in all the ways that we shouldn't be doing it: class, race, gender, and that's that I find, rightly offensive. That should continue to be offensive. The same way, that man who went running, and I have to, I'm going to look up his name. The man who went running, who was just recently killed, out in the light of day. It's that offensive when we can't see that some people who should be able to do things that anybody should do can't do them. Just simply outright can't do them. We just don't find a way to accommodate everyone in this world the way we ought to. So I think home's a really important place where that is happening every day. It's just not visible. We don't see it.
I want to bring both Jane and Leo back into the conversation, and one dimension of what you were just saying. I know, I think Jane can certainly speak to this, but I'm sure Leo can as well. And it's a theme that I've touched on. I've had some other conversations with educators through Young Philosophers of New York about this experience. And I'm an educator. I teach college. I work with youth, but I am now being thrust into a position, as many of us are, to being the sort of a teacher, quasi-teacher of my children. And that's not my role. I'm not their teacher, I'm their parent. And this is placing various demands. I'm not a second grade teacher, but now I am sort of a second grade teacher, or at least I'm a teacher's assistant.
Good for you, Joe, because I can't do the second grade math, so I commend you.
Well, it's, I have a seventh grader and an eighth grader, and they're pretty much, they're on their own, so to speak, but it's,
anyway,
these are, and so that was one thing I was thinking about. I mean, you were going much deeper and much broader and more many more significant dimensions of your point, but the anxieties and the stresses that are being placed on parents who are being asked to take on these new roles, often without the resources, whether they're material or whether they're intellectual is not the word I really want to use here, but I mean, trying to be the teacher of your own child is not the easiest thing to do. They want to interact with you in one way rather than in this other way, and that just is adding to the stresses, adding to the tension in the house. The arguments are increasing, and so coming back, whether the political dimension of this, but the home is not is ceasing to be the concept of the home as this safe haven. Jane, like the poem, I was it by Brooks?
Gwendolyn Brooks.
Gwendolyn Brooks. It just, the sentiment there, the grandmother creating kind of this environment, that you almost like want to like wrap yourself in, the sweet memories of it, the security of it. That's not what this home looks like right now. And I'm sure, and as Jen, you're talking, getting to, and like you, I have it pretty good, relatively speaking. I get that, and it's tough. So I mean, I did. So I want like to hear, what Jane and Leo, you want to kind of come in here and what I'm curious. What, how is the law going to address some of this? What Jen is describing is kind of like this kind of politicization. And I'm sure, Jen, you're going to say it's already been there. Certainly, it's already been there for many other homes and families. But is there something that the law can do? And what are the poems going to look like? How can we address this?
We're also talking a little bit about two different things: the concept of home and housing, where I feel like home has an emotional. It is idealized. Our homes is ideally what I want our homes to be. It's that idea, like how in one of the poems she says the thing you underline over and over again. It's this thing we're trying to make, or how Joe is saying his home isn't like the nice apartment above the Someday Liquor Gardens right now, where they're eating apples and walnuts and his grandma's laughing and lingering. It's like there's the ideal and then the reality. There's the physical housing that we have to deal with, and then there's home, the thing we're trying to achieve with our housing. It's not this automatic thing. Your housing doesn't equal the home. And just because you have a house doesn't mean you have a home. And you can feel that as a person in a society. And that's what I feel like you're really articulating beautifully, is the different, that those are two different things. And it is a struggle. And that it's like, so it's always been a struggle. It's not like this new struggle. It's as old as life itself. People looking for homes, looking for their quarters, their housing, to be a home, to be safe, to be their castle. However, that's this metaphor that we want to feel that. But in one man's castle, yeah, it's his castle, but how does the wife feel about that? Is it her castle? What's your role in the castle? How do the kids feel? And then thinking of kids having safe space. It's like, just because the kid has housing, that doesn't mean it's a home. Above Someday Liquor Gardens was definitely a home. That was like a warm place where there was nourishment and love and kindness and warmth. That's home. But that just because you have a house or a place to stay doesn't mean you can do that. So what does our society do to support people to have homes and not just housing? Like, why don't homeless people want to go to shelters? We know why. They're not homes. They're not safe. They're not you sleep. I have friends that have been homeless, and it's way safer to sleep on the train or in the streets than at a shelter. And it's just, how is our society going to make it so that people can have safe spaces for everyone? Because if everyone has a safe space to be, then everyone can be safe. Because what makes things unsafe is other people's unsafety. They're trying to achieve safety, and they threaten your safety to achieve some safety for themselves. And it's like, we're fighting over that. So those are, it's like really, it is interesting. And it's like the next level thing of society, like that we've been dealing with this problem for so long, since the beginning of time. How are we going to outgrow this? How are we going to outgrow it?
Jane, your comments just now might have gone some ways to answering a comment and a question that we actually got on the Facebook page, and it's from Patty Otis Abel, and she says, wonderful discussion. As I listen, I wonder if when the physical home, so I take it the house, the housing you're talking about, the physical home becomes unsafe, impossible to practice social distancing, or a place of domestic violence, we must retain it as a place in our minds, that it, like in the poem, calling it any place that the dog and the toothbrush are.
Mm-hmm.
So is the idea of home an essential concept of our humanity as love, food?
I think so. And I think we have to have that's actually part of the self. As we define ourselves and recognize ourselves, it has to do with our needs being met. Who are we? What are our needs? We all have different needs. And how are our needs met by our physical reality? And where can we feel our needs being met? And cooperate with our needs being met, like, helping them be met. It's something we have to participate in. We have to be able to participate in making our housing our home. So
can I interject just quickly, because I think one of the things that I think is important about that, especially when it comes to the different shifting roles that we might have right now, one thing I would say before this, as a teacher, philosophy of ed was one of my classes: no parent blaming, no teacher blaming, no student blaming. Once you take that hot potato of blame, who should be doing what, who hasn't done what they're supposed to do, once you take that out and you put that down, the tone of whatever has to be done expectation wise is so much more possible. Like, you create just opportunity for people to kind of come at it in all kinds of ways. That's the first thing. But the other side of that coin, which I think is exactly what Jane's also describing, is the power for home to be a place to de-shame. That's why I connect it to toileting, or the ways in which, like you said, with homelessness, that it's safer in some ways because of the degree to which one is going to be free from being shamed. We're really good in this society at shaming people. People internalize it. They burden themselves with it. I should be doing this. I should be doing that. I failed at this. I failed at that. And I think that strategies of de-shaming become part of care communities, and that's what makes places not just homes but neighborhoods, right? This idea that expanded what Leo described, when you have, it's not the architecture of a one place with the door, it's that the neighbor can see what those kids are doing and say, hey, you kids, stop, cut it out. That there's a community of people who are helping people learn how to meet those basic needs without the attachment of some kind of long-term shame or trauma, which I think is, we as a society, particularly in the United States, I think we have a rhetoric to know how to shame people into believing that they're automatically unsuccessful when they don't meet those expectations that have been put upon them. And again, there's so many ways in which that's why poetry is so empowering, because it gives us strategies that traditional ways of talking about it can't do. We just can't. There's no ways to de-shame until you hear those words that affirm something that you haven't been able to put words on. So I'm grateful for this part of your contribution. I think it's so important that we keep listening to the poets and the artists about how shame has to be suspended.
You're using this phrase that I don't really know, care community. Can you define that for me and help me specifically see what that means when you're saying it?
I can. I have, I'm working on it now. Care communities comes out of a lot of the disability scholarship. It's this idea that when people come and live together, they have strategies to, again, redistribute the labor of having to live in the everyday that is meaningful, that they're able to bear witness to one another.
So that's
in ways,
the family.
That's that. But again,
right.
the idea that even within queer communities, very often when they had to leave birth homes,
right.
they set up houses, right? These
right,
homes.
Exactly. And so your family, not your literal blood family, but the people you choose to have around you to support you. That's your care community.
Right. And there's an author, Leah Lakshmi Papazina, Samarasina, I'd have to put it in the comments, I might be able to do it later. She wrote a book called Care Work, and it's about all the ways in which, as a disabled person with different disabilities, set up kind of like networks of different people who knew how to help each other out in all the kinds of ways. And if somebody didn't have something, someone else sought other people who could get it. And so there were a lot of ways in which it was like an extended network of a care community, cobbled together out of the marginalization of a society that wouldn't provide, would give no comfort.
Yeah, a network of like shared resources and support. Yeah, we definitely need more things like that. Like, it's making me think of, that's kind of like what AA is. You know, it's a resource for you to get support to manage everyday living more successfully, in terms of being able to like feed yourself and get dressed and go do stuff to be the person you want to be.
I have, with the Public Philosophy Network, I have a short video that I did on helpfulness and helplessness in COVID. And one of the things I argue is the importance of a prosthetic effect of help, that it really does provide that relief. And it doesn't have to come in the form of like a super person that comes in and helps. It could come in the form of like the right medication and the right dosage. Creates a prosthetic effect. In other words, it does what it's supposed to do to provide that comfort and relief, even if it's temporary, and it changes all the time. But I think care communities have been really good at knowing what requires and what kind of a prosthetic effect looks like, in a way that a lot of traditional families, they don't care if you're relieved by the expectations. They just expect and demand it. And so again, the outside world that has a very high structure and a very high intolerance for people and their differences gets just magnified in the home. So the home becomes a place in which we just project the public expectations, but on a private, very intimate level, which is very traumatic, especially if you're a young person or you're an older person. I think of all the ways in which older people in their 80s and 90s do not understand what it is to stay home and like quarantine. Like, they don't understand like how this, like, I lived through a war. Like, why am I staying home and wearing a mask? Like, I think that we kind of have to kind of think about how things can become helpful when they have that right prosthetic effect. And again, care communities have literacy in that, I think.
Leo, in what ways do you think the law, you started by saying, you know, how important the home is in the law, but what how does the law either kind of encourage this precarity in the home that Jen was remarking on, and you know, how much and to what degree can the law be used to help create the sense of home that both Jen and Jane were talking about, that, you know, really making housing into a home, to use, you know, kind of the way Jane was putting it. Can the law help here? Is the law as it is problematic? I mean, does it, because it in some ways insulates the home? Is it the case? I mean, maybe this is what Jen was talking about, like you pull the veil, you know, close the curtain behind the home, and then rights are not being protected. Are you know, how do we, you know, how do we protect the home, support the home, without violating the home?
Right. So I think I think you could do that. I don't think it's really that hard. It's not really a legal matter. It's a political matter. You know, look, I'll give you an example of, you know, our lacking of a care community, and specifically involving disabled children. I represent families, a few families who have children with disabilities, and in this case, and I'm going to they're all against the Success Academy charter schools. And I don't, don't want to go down the whole anti-success, even though I would love to, but I'm not going to. But because it doesn't just happen there. But what success?
Just as a side note, Leo, I'm so here for that. Whatever I want to hear all about this. We have to do that as a sidebar, though.
Yeah. No, but I represent some families with kids with disabilities. I don't have to tell this group, kids with a million amazing qualities, but the schools get fearful that they're going to somehow contribute to bringing down test scores, so they figure out ways to get them out of the school. One kid that who occasionally acted out in class, but he had, he wasn't violent, but he wouldn't hurt other people, but he would start to like move his desk around and stuff like that. They took the kid out and took him and just dumped him at the 79th precinct and told police precinct and told his mother to go pick him up. But the truth is that there's decent laws about educating disabled kids. I mean, it's actually been a pretty good development in the last 30, 40 years of legal development. The question is there the political wherewithal and the resources to make those laws really work for people? And so for example, I mean, Success Academy doesn't say you're disabled, I'm afraid you're going to get a low grade in the math state tests, so goodbye. They harass them out, to get around the law. They call ACS on the families, to say that they're not doing something, or they suspend them, and they do all these kinds of things. So and again, it's Success Academy, but not every there's other schools aren't doing a great job with this either. And the question is, what kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a compassionate society that brings all the kids up and sees the qualities and what some of these kids can add to our society? Or do we just want to, educate on the cheap and, and make everybody in the, cookie cutter, high SAT scoring kind of kids, kind of adults, that then get certain kinds of jobs. So we are not, it's really, so what can the law do? Well, you hire basically one of the schmucks like me who's willing to do it, and and represent them and show how this pattern, is actually violating the law, but the law is there. It's the political will. So there's that. And I also want to talk about the safety of the home a little bit, based on the actual, experience that I have. There's a family that I represented, a mother who was a crack addict, got pregnant, had twins, in her 30s, got her act together, like just went to NA, did the whole thing, and got her shit together, worked for a while, but then she was disabled, so she lives on disability. She had her twins. She gave birth to twins. The twins came back. Now she's in her 50s. These kids are in their 30s, the twins. And one of the twins, two boys, have a daughter who's 16, who lived in the house as well. Daughter was doing by the way, the twins were also addicts, but got their shit together. And now these four made a home. And the whole, it's the grandmother, the uncle, the father, and this girl. And they've made a home. And the whole sort of thing is organized around making this girl's life good, so the two boys, they get, they're not educated, but they get construction jobs, they do the thing. Anyway, there happened to have been a shooting near where their house, where they live. They live like in a public housing, but it's like a townhouse. And it was by where they lived. And it's these two, 30-year-old black men. And the cops just can't believe that they don't have something to do with it. and it was sort of high profile. So they keep going to get search warrants. And they keep swearing out search warrants. This is a place that's filled. It's like a major drug operation, and there's an arsenal of guns. There's narcotics. There's money. There are tens of thousands of dollars in there.
Just to be clear, in the townhouse.
In this little house where they live, yes, that's what they're claiming.
Oh, that's what they're claiming. They're claiming.
Right.
Okay.
And the judge signs a search warrant, and they go in, and 4 times out of 4, one of the brothers has a little dime bag in his underwear drawer. He's like, I come home from work, I work like 12 hours, I go out, they have like a little space that's outdoor, I smoke because it helps me relax, right? So every time they do this, they don't find guns, they don't find narcotics, they just find a dime bag. All the adults get arrested. The child goes into administrative, an ACS, and then they're in this thing where they're trying to get this kid back, who, by the way, through this all does amazingly. I mean, she's incredibly poised, and it's really rather remarkable.
Well, that's evidence of her care. You can behave like that and handle trauma better if you know you're loved and supported, and that things are going to get better. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, that's evidence that she's taken care of.
And these people made a home, and try as they might, the government, the cop, they keep getting involved and screwing it up as much as they can. So as much as I talked about at the beginning of this, and it's still true, you still have to go to a judge and convince a judge that this is happening. But, if you're willing to swear to it, you'll get it, and they do get it. And so that clearly in a neighborhood like this, where you may be close to violence, you're very at risk that your home, even when everyone's doing a good job inside, is not safe. I mean, this is police with battering rams coming in at 6 a.m. Imagine having a 6-year-old dog with shields and like big long guns, not just handguns, right? So no safety. Finally, and I'll just say this quickly, politicization in the home. I did a First Amendment case about ballot selfies. People like to take a picture of who they voted for and then put it on Facebook. And that's actually illegal under New York law. And I brought a First Amendment lawsuit to challenge it. And one of the defenses was, I don't know, it's not unreasonable, is that, even if you have an absentee ballot and you do it at home, you take a picture that the man in the house may demand that the woman votes a certain way and for her to prove it. And, so that this ballot selfie sort of enables the coercion of voting. So, to sort of go to your domestic violence, I've done a million things around domestic violence, but that one struck me as particularly like, well, I could see that happening. I could see that happening. And we wound up losing that case, not just because of that, but just an interesting sort of practical experience I've had with that kind of thing too. So that's what I think that sort of talks about some of the things you wanted to bring out, Joe.
Yeah, you did. Thank you. We're at about the 1:20 mark, I think, here. And
well, we started late, but
we did. Does anybody want to? Is there something that you want to say that hasn't been addressed? I mean, I'm sure there's a long list of things that we haven't been able to address. But Jen, do I see? Is there something you want to get in here?
Well, I wanted to mention Ahmaud Arbery
Yes.
was the name of the man that was killed, because I didn't want that to go without recognition. I think they're doing a run tomorrow. People are doing a 2-mile 23, something like that. And so just as I think as a comment on, I think what we are also holding together, all of us, in thinking through home, is that relationship between coercion and consent. And I think it's really, when I think about that question of what consent looks like when you are a dependent, when you're depending on others in your family to do that work. I'm not working, my husband's working, he works for transit. He's a bus operator, so they have the highest rate right now, so I'm completely dependent on him in a way that I had never anticipated. And I think that vulnerability that comes with being dependent in a way that you're not able to self-determine has to have more narratives. We have to create these new narratives around this novel relationship about what dependency means and how it is not shameful. It is still a place of creative self-determination, and that it does not have to be coerced, that when one depends on another, that one should not also have to be coerced, that one can still consent even if they're a position of dependence and not full independence as our society has determined. I think a lot of us know what that is a little bit better now, because we're very now all dependent on this, on the healthcare workers, flattening the curve, Governor Cuomo, Donald Trump, not misinforming everybody about what to do next, or hiring people, or keep maintaining people who have the authority. We're all dependent on this now in a way that makes us feel coerced and makes us all feel very vulnerable. And I think that's one of the things that we've all kind of skirted around, but also spoke to, I think, very interestingly. So that would be my final thought on this. I think this is helpful.
Yeah, it's like our first episode was interdependence and our second was freedom.
Yes.
Believe
me, I've thought about that.
Exactly. Yeah. And we talked about all of those things, and it does very naturally lead up to this, and it's like what you're bringing out too is like there's and it's also what Leo talked about, how nature can come in your house, but the king can't come in your house. Like, you can't protect it against nature. And just because your house actually might be weak, like not a castle at all, but more a tent or whatever, it's the idea of it, and it's that we each have a little bit of a different idea of it, and how are we going to let this diversity of homes exist? That your definition of what your home isn't going to be this person's home, but there's still equivalent homes,
And if we have these ideas about home, the kind of home and hearth ideas about home, then what kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a society that gives everybody a home like that? That not only tells you the king can't come in, but that we're going to help you, so that the rain and the wind don't come in either.
Right.
And I say that metaphorically for a lot of things. And I think, sadly, this time is laying bare the shortcomings of our society,
yes,
in terms of helping its citizens. And this time, there's no excuse, because after all, it's the government doing it to us. It's the government saying, you can't go out and work. So really, we ought to be really helping people.
Yeah. Are we going to get to keep our homes? How are they going to help us do that?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just and it's a home crisis rather than it's merely a housing crisis. That
yes.
Ahmed Arbery, I shared on the Gotham Philosophical Society page, actually, but a piece by Charles M. Blow. I believe it was in today's New York Times, which I recommend. It was a very, very kind of moving, I thought, a powerful piece.
Joe, can I just add something right here? Just take my privilege as a civil rights lawyer, and I tend to sort of take these horrible things a little more in stride than the average, because, it's what I look at a lot. But, it's bad enough that there's bad enough people to do what they did to this boy, to this young man. But it was the local authorities saw that video and said, that's okay, for 2.5 months. And, we're never going to stop people doing bad things, but we could at least try to not enable it. And that's what they were doing there. And that's really, to me, with all due respect to this man's life, which is a horror, but that's really the story here.
Would it be possible, there's a piece, the care work piece, the book that I mentioned before, in the piece that I wrote on home, there's a long passage that I cite, but can I read a little bit? Because I think it really is, it moves us into a place of like hopefulness too. Again, it's Pipezina Samarasina says, no one told me it's okay and good to build relationships where you are loved and not just for your labor. You are renewable and also limited resource. You deserve to be held. There was more. I wanted to interrupt the cycles of abuse and intergenerational violence in my family, to know pleasure, not martyrdom, to know freedom, joy, and liberation. These are powerful, fierce survivor freedom dreams.
Thank you
Beautiful.
for that thought.
And whoever spells the author's name correctly gets a prize from Joe.
We will, I mean, it's on the GPS site, Jen's essay, which I recommend people read, Home, Fire on New York. But Jen, we can put that, any links, so Jane is going to give us the poems, and any particular links you want to share, we can put on Facebook, so anybody who goes, so this video will be saved for posterity. People can see this video and they will be able to see any links like in comments. Okay.
Great.
Thank you so much, Leo, Jane, Jen. Thank you. This was it was enjoyable. It was worthwhile. It was moving. It was it made me angry.
Joe, you're going to invite me back, right?
I think we are going to invite you back.
Thank you.
Yes, we will, because we've got things on maybe I shouldn't say it, but Success Academy to talk about.
Yes.
No,
follow up.
we will have other topics to talk about. But again, thank you so much. Be well. I hope your loved ones are well, and take care of your homes.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Bye-bye.